Good morning. Thank you so much for having me at this event today. I'm delighted to be here giving you an overview of this recent update to WBCSD's Vision 2050. It's a huge piece of work, a comprehensive framework to guide business action in line with the challenges that we face as global societies. So it's quite hard for me to give you an overview in 10 to 15 minutes, but I'll do my very best. And I'm going to spend my time this morning talking to you a little bit about the background to Vision 2050, the original, how it came about, and therefore also why we decided to update Vision 2050 over the last few years. So the background to Vision 2050 is that back in 2010, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD, brought together 29 of its members to answer a pretty simple question. What does a sustainable world look like and how do we get there? And it was actually the first time that that question had been asked. So the original Vision 2050 was quite groundbreaking insofar as it presented a picture of a world that was sustainable by 2050, where 9 billion people could live well within planetary boundaries. And it also laid out how business could help drive that transformation. And the other reason that it was quite groundbreaking is that it was the first time that business had openly stated that clearly, if we wanted to bring that sustainable world about, business as usual was not going to be an option. At the heart of the original Vision 2050 were 9 pathways, which laid out the transformations that needed to take place over the course of the next out by sectors mainly, so agriculture, forests, energy and power, buildings, mobility, materials, but also 3 core challenges from the way that sustainability was viewed at the time: people's values, human development, and the economy. And it was also split into 2 time frames. The turbulent teens through to 2020, when we would spend time really trying to figure out how we would bring these transformations that were required about, and then a more calm, less volatile period, which they call the transformation time from 2020 to 2050, when we would actually implement the fruits of our labors over the turbulent teens, having figured out how to deal with that volatility and drive transformation forward. Any of you that have picked up a paper in the last year and a half will probably agree with me when I say that the turbulent teens aren't yet over. The teens are still living at home with their parents, and they look like they might be for some time to come. And so this was really part of the reason for why we decided we needed to have another look at Vision 2050 back in when we started the project in 2019. We said that essentially the turbulence hadn't finished, that the risks had only built over the last 10 years, that whilst immense progress has been made over 10 years, it is nowhere near sufficient given the scale of the challenges that we face. And therefore, it was right for us to come back to Vision 2050 and ask how WBCSD could help drive transformation at the rate and scale required within what many of you may recognize as what's called a VUCA world, a world that's volatile, a world that is uncertain, a world that is complex, and a world that is ambiguous. We wanted to help companies by showing how we could use vision to translate volatility into vision. We could translate uncertainty into understanding, complexity into clarity, and ambiguity into agility. So that was really the reason why we said, okay, it's right that we go back to Vision 2050. There is a need for it. We need to reset the agenda for action on these sustainability challenges over the decade to come. So that was the sort of the framing. So then once we agreed to revisit Vision 2050 with our executive committee here at WBCSD, we proposed that we went about updating the project with 4 key goals in mind. One, that we would actually provide companies with some background as to how systems transform. If everything is about systems transformation, then we need to understand how we actually transform systems. Secondly, we wanted to provide companies with a common narrative that they could rely on amongst each other, grounded both in opportunity but also in business reality, and that they could leverage, therefore, as a key strategic input in order to set their own strategic business planning and sustainability planning, and as a catalyst for engagement so that they could inspire those that they work with, those within their value chains, the policymakers that they rely on, their customers, and so on and so forth, their entire ecosystems, into driving these enormous changes that are required. We brought together a group of 40 companies who participated in updating the work from, again, a good range of geographies and from industry sectors. And we also went about our work in partnership with our global network, partners such as XXI, EMPRESAS, and others all around the world. This plan was cut slightly short by the reality of the pandemic, preventing us from visiting as many places, but we still soldiered on with online events and made sure that we were creating a global reflection of how to address the challenges we face, not one that was solely created from offices within Geneva, Europe, the US, the places that are often accused of trying to drive the agenda. We know how important it is that this agenda is reflective of the challenges that people face all around the world. And as a final way to make sure that the work was as valuable and as accurate and as effective as possible, we pulled together an external advisory committee to guide us from many of the world's most recognized thinkers in a range of different disciplines, from sustainability to biodiversity to human rights and so on. All of which led us to the launch of Vision 2050 that came about in late March of this year. The work has been pretty much completely redesigned from top to bottom. The one major thing that remains completely constant between the two pieces of work is the vision of 9 billion people living well within planetary boundaries. We did add a little plus to the 9 because clearly population growth will not cease at 9 billion based on current projections. So the update to Vision 2050, Time to Transform, which was released in March, keeps that ultimate vision, 9+ billion people living well within planetary boundaries. But what we've done this time is we said, okay, actually what the real challenge is that all of this is centered on the need to transform. We do not really understand how those transformations need to happen, that it's far more complicated than just picking a set of actions that businesses need to take. You need to understand the full picture. So let's do our best to provide business with the full picture of the changes that need to happen and the role that business can play in driving those changes forward. So what we've provided with our updated Vision 2050 is a comprehensive framework for business action in line with the challenges that we face as global societies. But the underlying reality of what we've created is that this is really a piece of work that provides companies with what they need to understand if they're going to run their companies well into the future. How do they be prosperous as we transition from an economy that exists in a world that looks like the one we live in today and transition into one that is an economy that exists in a more sustainable future? How do they prosper in that transition, and how do they help bring that transition about so that they can prosper well into the future as well? The report does that by splitting itself up into 5 main sections. We have the first section, Time for a Shared Vision, where we lay out that vision of 9+ billion people living well within planetary boundaries. And we actually do what we weren't able to do 10 years ago, which is to very crisply define what it actually means for 9+ billion people to live well within planetary boundaries. So we set out 5 fundamental characteristics of living well and 8 fundamental characteristics of living within planetary boundaries, and make it absolutely clear that those are the things that we're working towards. Those are our end states that will bring about a stable, prosperous future for both business and society. Then we have a section called Time for Action. That looks at these 9 pathways where business can really help to drive the kinds of transitions and transformations that are required. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. We outline 3 fundamental mindset shifts that we feel are critical to being able to take any of the actions that are required. And then we have a chapter called Time to Succeed, where we look at how systems transform, and we outline how business needs to be bold enough to lead the changes that are required, whilst simultaneously being humble enough to understand that it can't drive those changes on its own. And there are areas where it has to collaborate in order to take the action that it takes and translate it into impact at societal scale. And finally, we conclude with our section on time for leadership, where we outline the 3 main factors that will drive these transformations forward. And they are a shared vision, systems thinking, and the need for mindset shifts. And you'll get a bit of a clearer picture on those things as I run through in a tiny bit more detail on some of these main sections, starting with our 9 transformation pathways, which are at the heart of our update to Vision 2050. But they are completely different to the original 9 transformation pathways that were in the original vision. And the reason for that is that the original pathways very much centered on the industry sectors that were represented by the companies who were in the original project. Whereas here, what we actually did is we said, what are the essential things that society requires, and therefore that business exists to provide? And so we came up with these 9 essential areas of societal need that business products and services exist to satisfy. And they are energy, living spaces, where we live both rurally and in urban environments, the built environment effectively, transportation and mobility, products and materials, financial products and services, connectivity, sort of the digital world that we now inhabit, health and well-being, water and sanitation, and food. These things are things that society absolutely has to have, that business therefore exists to provide. And so in each of these 9 pathways, we have outlined a vision, firstly, for that pathway in particular, the societal need that business can meet by 2050. We outline comprehensively the transitions that will get us there. So in each case, we lay out 7 transitions that together cover the full range of changes that need to happen in order for that vision to be achieved. And then we lay out 10 prioritized actions for business, which aren't comprehensive. At WBCSD, we work with a huge range of companies. These are the actions that we could collaboratively agree with the companies that we worked with. But so people can pick holes in them. But the point is that even if you can find other things that should be added to the list, or you have a difference of opinions about what the prioritization should be, getting these 10 actions completed in any of these pathways will be a massive step forward from where we are now. And so I'll just very quickly give you an example from energy. The vision for energy is that by 2050, we have a sustainable energy system providing reliable and affordable net zero carbon energy for all. We then have 7 key transitions that we lay out that cover the full range of changes that need to happen, from technology to infrastructure, to policies, whatever it might be. And of course, that we have a just transition that leaves no one behind. And that's the same for all pathways. Those kinds of themes are covered in each. And then action areas that again cover policy requirements, behavioral requirements, technological requirements, investment requirements, all of which are designed to be prioritized, effectively making the SDGs actionable for business and doing our very best to ensure that we get as far towards those SDGs being achieved as we can by their deadline in 2030. And that's the case for each of the 9 different pathways. A quick moment on the mindset shifts. These basically are at the heart of our ability to even begin to take the actions that we outline in the pathways. taking those actions, even though we've been quite prescriptive and said, like, here are the things that you need to do, they're not simple. They are big, big lifts. And so therefore, actually, what lies at the heart of being able to take those lifts are mindset changes within business. We have one mindset change called reinvention, which is really about capitalism itself, not by any means saying that we think that capitalism needs to stop, but that it needs to adapt and be reinvented so that the outcomes that it currently produces, which are unarguably not all positive, and in many cases are completely unsustainable, are reinvented, and we transform our current model to a model that rewards true value creation rather than value extraction, as the current model does. If you start thinking differently about your purpose as a company within society, how you define your success, then you actually start to think differently about what success means and the timescales that you judge success over. And that lets you start thinking about what it really means to be resilient in the long term. And how resilience isn't necessarily about protecting the status quo, but understanding that change is constantly happening and that businesses need to be able to exist in a world that is constantly changing. And then actually the best thing they can do is adapt to change in a way that drives change in a positive direction and ensures their long-term success. And so how do we think differently about long-term resilience? And if we think differently about long-term resilience, then we start to think differently about what we rely on, about how the inputs, where the inputs come from that we rely on, how we get our customers, how we exist in ecosystems that can be resilient into the long term. And that actually drives us towards a more regenerative mindset, where we start really focusing on how we can exist within communities that are thriving, that we can trade with, and on a healthy planet that allows us all to exist happily and healthily. So there are these three core mindsets at the center of the document that were really fundamental to actually giving ourselves as businesses the permission to drive the kinds of changes that the pathways lay out and require. And then finally, in section 4, as I said, we have this section on systems thinking, and really very briefly, there's a huge amount of background information in the document and also in issue briefs that we released in support of the report. But there's this very simple idea of how systems transform, which is there are two major pressures that can drive any sort of change to a current system: macro trends and innovations. But if we really want that change that those pressures exert to be translated into a transformed system, then we need to look at these enablers of transformation, of norms and values, of policy and regulation, of how information flows around the system, of how money flows around the system, and the kinds of technologies that actually we use to manage our system itself. And so in this section, in Time to Succeed, we look at these factors, and then we also spend time looking at how business can better approach 4 key enablers of change that are beyond its own doors, effectively where it has to collaborate in order to translate the actions that it takes into actual societal impact and scale. And we look at how business can rethink the way it works with finance and investment, of how it can shift its approach to technology and innovation, of how it can think better about the way it interacts with individuals and with consumption. Essentially, the ultimate implementer of any solution will be an individual. And finally, how policy and regulation are absolutely central to any meaningful change at scale, and how business can rethink the way in which it collaborates with policymakers in order to support the kinds of changes that are required if we are going to achieve that vision of 9+ billion people living well within planetary boundaries. Very final statement. I know I'm rushing through this, but I'm really just trying to give you a flavor of what's in Vision 2050. Very final thing to say is that the leadership statement at the beginning really lays out in incredibly brief terms what it is that we're hoping to achieve with this document. It's signed by 42 CEOs, chairmen, and board members from our member companies. And really, it restates this idea that what Vision 2050 provides companies with is a comprehensive framework for action. It shows you the full picture of the things that you need to factor into your decision making if you want to drive meaningful change. It lays out the specific actions that you can take in those areas that are most relevant to your business through its 9 pathways. But then it also makes sure that you understand what it will take to translate those actions that you take into a wider, more meaningful scale, how you can accelerate that action through things such as the mindset shifts and the enablers of change. So with all that said, I hope that gives you a flavor for what we've tried to achieve with this update to Vision 2050. As it says, it's time to transform. I'm so glad that you're all together today to discuss how you can do that in Latin America, and I wish you the best of discussions and the clearest of views towards the transformations that you can take yourselves. Thank you.